I think if I could find a foolproof way to beat the Sicilian, I'd be fighting for the World Championship. Books like this would like to sell you an easy answer, a quick fix. But looking over all this stuff, I'm afraid I just don't see it. How can you believe this analysis when 6 months later, after the book is published, one of the very same authors is telling you how to win with the Neidorf, or some such title? Frankly, it's a joke. Now, the purpose of these two videos is to equip you with a dangerous weapon against the Sicilian defence. That is to say, the Morra Gambit, where white sacrifices or offers the sacrifice of a pawn at move 2. d4, c takes d4, c3. What are the advantages of playing this gambit? Well, crucially, you'll probably know more about this gambit than your opponent will. I don't really see the point in bashing out theory going straight down his favourite main line. Is it likely that you're going to know more about it than him? Hardly. Playing the Morra Gambit, you're likely to get a strong initiative, and the initiative is valuable at all levels of chess. And finally, the accepted black defences, the so-called refutations, are perhaps not quite as good as they look, and I'll be showing you the antidote to each as we go on through the video. The Morra Gambit may not be the best way to meet the Sicilian defence, but unless I study chess 25 hours a day, I don't think I'm ever going to find that. No, I think the Morra Gambit can be seen as a point-scoring, no-nonsense practical weapon for white. Firstly, let me take you through the contents of this video. In the opening section, I'll be showing you the ideal layout for the white pieces in the Morra Gambit. In the second section, I'll be showing you ideas, tricks and traps that are common in Morra Gambit positions. Then we'll go on to examining the theory. In the next section of the tape, I'll show you what happens when black plays the solid main line of the Morra Gambit. That's to say, after Queen e2, Bishop e7, Rook d1, where black plays e5. This is very common, and many of your opponents will do this. We'll look at how white tackles that type of position. Next up, we'll be looking at Joe Gallagher's antidote to the Morra Gambit, as recommended in his book, Beating the Anti-Sicilians. That is to say, a6 in this particular position, and after castles, black plays knight f6, intending bishop g4. I'll be showing you exactly what I think white should do against this. In the next section, we'll be looking at the fianchetto variation, which doubtless many dragon players will try. And against this, I'm going to recommend a barnstorming variation starting with the move 6h4. Watch out for some real fireworks in this section. We then move on to examine a line recommended by Jeremy Silman in his book Winning with the Sicilian Defence. That is to say, a line where black delays the move knight f6, preferring to develop his bishops first. Here you see the position coming up in front of you, and now Silman recommends the move bishop d7. This is really quite a tough nut to crack, but I'll be showing you what I think is the best line for white here. If we change the position a little bit, put a black knight on f6 and a black queen on c7, we reach the next variation considered in the video. I don't particularly rate this early development of the queen by black, and I reckon that with bishop f4, white drums up a very good attack. We'll then move on to looking at the popular lines where black plays an early knight e7. This can occur when white castles and black plays an immediate knight e7. That's considered to be the main line of this system. Or where black delays the move d6, instead preferring a6, bringing about this position. In either case, white should be able to whip up good chances with the move bishop g5. Watch out for a game by Garry Kasparov as black in this system, where he got into trouble. And to close the video, I'll be looking at miscellaneous systems for black, where he omits the early knight c6. I'll be looking at 4e6 and 4a6. These are dangerous systems for an unprepared white player, and I'll be showing you the antidote to both of these as we run through the video. The Morra Gambit is an exciting opening where white strives for the initiative from move 1. In this, the first section of the video, I'll be showing you the typical layout that white adopts in the Morra Gambit against virtually all black setups, and the way in white builds a launch pad for the attack to come. The opening moves are as follows. White plays e4, c5, and now the immediate central advance, d4. In the accepted Morra, black will take on d4, and when white plays c3, offering a second pawn, black takes that too. D takes c3. And now white plays knight takes c3. Well, here we have the first important position of the Morra Gambit. And as you can see, for the sacrificed pawn, white has open lines for all his pieces. It's very easy for white to develop his pieces. The question is, where should they go? Now, normally in this position, black will play knight c6, and then white continues with simple, easy development. Just knight to f3. And now we're going to see how white should bring out his pieces in the Morra Gambit. Firstly, what to do with the bishop on f1. Well, in almost all cases, that bishop will be developed to c4. A nice aggressive square in the centre of the board, potentially eyeing up f7. At any rate, there's pressure down the a2 to g8 diagonal. Almost every time, white is going to castle. Simple developing move, bringing the rook into the game. That's quite indispensable. And now, what to do with the queen? Well, again, in most cases, the queen will go to e2. This is quite an important square, because on e2, the queen is supporting the e4 pawn for a possible e5 advance. That often causes confusion in the black camp. And then the rook on f1 will slide across to d1. So the queen and the rook occupy harmonious positions. And as you can see, the position of the rook vis-a-vis the black queen is quite awkward for black. Probably black will move that queen as soon as he sees the rook appearing on the d file. And this is another important trump in white's armoury, the fact that the rook is opposite the queen, forcing the queen to move. It might cause confusion in the black camp. Now we come to an interesting moment, what to do with the bishop on c1. This is probably the most difficult piece to place correctly in the Morra Gambit, because in certain circumstances the bishop belongs on e3, in others on f4, and in the final case on g5. What sort of scenarios enable us to place this piece properly? Well, here we have a typical position from a main line of the Morra Gambit, and black has just played the move knight g8 to e7. Now in the lines with knight e7, and there are many of them, bishop g5 is the best move, because it ties the black pieces up. This is the usual case where bishop g5 comes in handy. As you can see, there's an immediate pin on the knight. In fact, white has set a very cunning trap in this position, because if black kicks the bishop immediately, then knight b5 virtually wins the game for white. Many strong players have fallen for that trap, although of course it's not guaranteed. But the idea is clear. Bishop g5 should be used generally against the knight e7 systems. It's less effective when there's a black knight on f6, because black can just usually get out of the pin. There are usually more effective placements for the bishop than g5 when the black knight stands on f6. Later on in the video, we'll see situations where black tries to force white to put his bishop on g5 by adopting some cunning move orders, and thus place this problem piece less effectively. Now here we see a scenario where white would put his bishop on f4. That is to say, when the black queen has come out prematurely to either c7 or it's slid along the back rank in one go to b8. This would be a typical situation where white would play bishop f4. In almost no other case is the bishop placed effectively on this square. So watch out for early developments by your opponent's queen. Then you can think about putting the bishop on f4. Finally, and most commonly, the normal position for this bishop is e3. Why is this? Well, I would say it's a very good central square for the bishop. The bishop retains options. It gazes over all parts of black's position. I suppose the only difficulty with this bishop is that it might get booted away by knight g4. That's why quite often white prefaces the move bishop e3 with the simple little move h3, which takes away a lot of black's counterplay. And the move h3 should also be noted because black might be threatening, in this type of position, a trick with bishop g4 and knight d4, which is awkward for white. And as you can see, if white were to place his bishop on e3, that completely nullifies the black idea I've just mentioned. So bishop e3 in most cases is the best square for the bishop. Having therefore placed most of our pieces harmoniously, we come now to the final piece, the queen's rook. Well, in most cases the rook will slide across to c1, and as you can see, white has now attained a position of full development. There are some rare cases, if I can just set the position with the queen on c7 up again and put the white bishop on f4, there are some cases when you wouldn't put your rook on c1. You might choose rook d2 and rook a d1, pressurizing the d pawn. Those cases are rare, but it's an idea that you should note. So effectively here we have the full development of the Morra Gambit. It's white's launch pad from which he will build his attack. Now I'm going to show you some typical tricks and traps which black can fall into in the Morra Gambit. They quite often crop up, so you should note them closely. First of all, I'll take you through the short game Matulovic Grandmaster versus Vincente, Simeone 1954. It's an old game, but very thematic. Black falls for one of white's early traps. Well, the opening moves are e4, c5, d4, and black takes the gambit pawn, c3, dc3, knight c3. Black's knight comes out, white develops as per the programme. d6, bishop comes out to its strongest square, and now black makes a mistake. Knight to f6. Now I think you'll agree with me that this is a very plausible Sicilian move. Here it's just an outright mistake. Black must preface that move knight f6 with the move a6, and I'll show you why now. In Matulovic Vincente, white played the crushing move e5, and this is extremely awkward for black to meet. Black took this pawn with the pawn, d takes e5, and white swapped the queens off. Queen takes d8, check. And this poses black a very awkward problem. Well, I'll show you later on why knight takes d8 is not a very good move. Suffice it to say that after knight b5, white obtains a crushing position. We'll see why a little later on. But in Matulovic Vincente, black took white's queen with the king. This allows knight g5, another very strong move. And now it's very awkward for black. That double attack on f7 is very strong indeed. Black went king c7. Knight took on f7. Rook went to g8. And now white played knight b5 check. Just that move, knight f6, has exposed black to a crushing attack in the very opening of the game. King b8 was played. And now another exceptionally strong move by white. Knight takes e5. And black's position is really all over the place here. Of course, the intention after knight takes e5 is that when black takes, white should not take the rook on g8, although he can. Instead, bishop to f4, pinning the knight. And now look at the perilous position of the black king. I don't think there's any defence anymore. Poor Vincenti played knight d7. The only move to protect e5, and now white takes on g8. Bishop takes g8. Pawn came to a6. Knight went to d4. King went to a7. And after castles by white, black chose an elegant moment to resign. Watch out now, because here comes another moment when the move e5 can be particularly effective. On the board in front of you, you've got the position after 4 moves, and white's about to play knight f3. We'll follow the main line for a little while, where black plays d6, bishop comes out to c4, and now what looks like a very logical move, e6, blunting white's diagonal. Okay, white castles. Knight comes out to f6, queen comes to e2, bishop e7, typical Sicilian development, and now rook to d1. Setting up a trappy position. Now, if black was to carelessly castle here, as happened in the thematic game Kiffmeyer versus Sandmeyer, Wiesen, 1970, then e5 is a real cruncher, disrupting black's position. We should see this game because it's quite entertaining. Knight e8 was played by black, and white took on d6 immediately. Of course, that doesn't allow black to block the position with d5. Bishop takes d6 was played, and now knight b5, which I guess would have been the response to knight takes d6. Black played queen e7, that's why he took with the bishop to find a square for the queen to get out of the pin. And now bishop came out to g5. f6, only move. And now white dropped his bishop back to e3, with the crunching threat of taking on d6 with the knight and following up with bishop c5. So it's something Sandmeyer had to defend against immediately. After bishop e3, black played the miserable move bishop b8, and white played rook ac1. In this position, white has a crushing initiative. All of his pieces are in extremely strong positions. Black played b6. Now if we just retract that move, we see that the move black would like to play, that's a6, is forbidden because of bishop c5, which is a very strong reply. And if black takes that bishop, then bishop takes e6, check, would win his queen. So poor old Sandmeyer played b6. Bishop b3 was the reply, hitting the knight. Bishop b7 defending the knight. But now we see suddenly that e6 is unprotected, and white exploited this magnificently with the move bishop c5. Now that's a wonderful move. Typical Morra idea. White's got 2 extra rooks in the game, supporting his minor pieces. The minor pieces come in and administer the crushing blow. While black's got to take. Bishop takes e6 check. King h8. And now the rook swoops down to d7, winning the black queen. And thereafter, most of black's pieces. So Sandmeyer had enough, resigns. We move on now to examine black's predicament vis-a-vis the queen in the Morra Gambit. Black's got a slightly awkward choice of where to put his queen. It's difficult to find a square which is not particularly exposed. And I'd like to highlight that now by showing you a fragment of the game Lenoir, international master from Austria, against Shestiakov, again, international master. And this game was played at Kecskemét in 1991. And black is about to make his fatal error when he played knight to e5. Now, doubtless black was hoping that that would exchange off one of white's potential attacking pieces, but in fact, all it does is expose his queen on c7 to the rook, the power of that rook on c1. This is quite a common theme in the Morra, the rook powering down black's queen exposed on the c file, and white exploited this very nicely indeed. Before you go on, it might be worth just stopping the video to see if you can actually work out what white did next. It's very nice. Well, first of all, white got rid of black's pesky knight. Knight takes e5. d takes e5. And the net effect of that is, of course, that now both of white's rooks are in the game. But I suppose black felt that because white had many pieces on the c file, it wasn't that easy to take advantage of the fact that white's rook was opposite the black queen. But the move, of course, he didn't see in this position was bishop takes e6. And that move is just incredibly strong. Now, in the game, black went queen b6. Obviously, we should see what happens if black takes on e6. Now, it seems as though the most logical move is bishop takes e6 in this position, I would have thought. Well, in both cases, white is going to plonk that knight in on d5. And suddenly, it's incredibly difficult to find a good square for the black queen. That is the whole theme behind white's play. Well, where are you going to put the queen? If you put it on b8, at the very least, white can swipe that bishop on e7, hack off the knight on f6 and have a massive attack against black's exposed king. If black puts his queen on the d file anywhere, d6, d7 or d8, he'll simply lose the queen. Knight takes f6 check is a fatal discovery. And if not there, then where? Black can't even sacrifice his queen for 3 pieces in this position with knight takes d5, rook takes c7, knight takes c7, because bishop takes e7 not only regains all the lost material, but with bishop d6 next move, white's going to pick up some more material and be lots and lots of points ahead. I mentioned an interesting trap earlier where white put his bishop on g5 and black's knight was on e7. Let's see how we reach that position. Again, it's a very common idea running through the Morra. e4, c5, d4 takes, c3 and black snaps off the pawn. Knight takes c3, knight c6, knight f3, e6. I assure you lots of your opponents are going to play like this because they know you're going to put your bishop out on c4 and they want to blunt that bishop. Okay, well, d6, white castles, and now knight e7. Bishop comes out to g5. Now, there are 2 moves in this position which are okay for black. Well, I believe them to be slightly better for white, however black plays in this line. I'll show you why later. And those moves are f6, trying to take the sting out of that pin, and a6. But if black is careless enough to play the move h6, then he will find to his horror that knight b5 is a winning move. Because as you can see, white's queen and the knight power down on d6. And black's problem is he hasn't got a move here. He can't take the bishop on g5 because then knight takes d6 wins everything, wins the queen at least. And his other move, that is to say pawn to d5, can be met very, very effectively indeed by just bishop f4. And I think that simply wins the game. Black is powerless to stop knight c7 check. So I think you'll agree that is a very easy trap for black to fall into. And countless players have done so. Now, back in the early 1990s, an opening variation was discovered for black, which seemingly appeared to refute the Morra Gambit. And this was a line called the Siberian Trap. Now, let me just show you what that trap is. I think you're going to have to be aware of it if you play the Morra Gambit. Here we see a mainline position. White's about to play his move knight f3. Black goes e6. Bishop comes out to c4. And now black plays queen to c7. A quiet enough move, but the venomous introduction to the Siberian Trap. Now let me just show you what the trap is. It only works if white plays robotically. Let's say white were to castle. And back goes knight f6. And white plays queen to e2. All as per the programme, nothing unusual here. Well, then the Siberian Trap is black playing his knight to g4. And this is an incredibly difficult move to meet. In fact, white has gone wrong already. Because, well, many players just went h3 here. They didn't realise what black was up to. And then knight d4 just wins the game, as you can see. fork of queen and knight. If white takes the knight on d4, queen h2 is checkmate. So actually, after knight g4, black is threatening to win the game immediately with knight to d4. And of course, white's problems don't end there. For instance, if he were to play rook d1, which is the normal Morra Gambit move in this position, the trouble is for white that bishop c5 is just a very good move here. And that's the secondary point of knight g4. White cannot satisfactorily meet the threat to f2. So we have to find a way of meeting this dangerous system. Now, if we just tinker with white's move order a little bit, here we have the position after queen c7, and you'll recall that white castled. This is a mistake in my opinion. He should play queen to e2 first. And now I don't think it's possible for black to play his Siberian trap anymore. Because if he plays knight f6, then e5 is a very good move. This was only discovered after many, many painful short defeats have been inflicted on white. You would think that knight g4 was the point of black's play, and then when white plays bishop f4, as he must, black goes f6. And this just put a lot of white players off this particular line, because it seems as though black is just going to win that e-pawn. Only later was it discovered that white has a very good move in this position, which is knight d5. And now you can see again in the Morra Gambit that the black queen has become exposed. Exposed this time to the bishop on f4. Well, let's say black takes this knight, and white gets to play e takes f6 check. Okay, there's only, well, there are two moves for black really, but only one sensible move. That's knight c to e5. And as white's going to take this knight with his own knight, knight takes e5, they're going to transpose anyway. So let's say black puts one knight on e5, you take it, he takes back. And now queen h5 is the move to refute the Siberian trap. Because when black blocks with the move g6, very plausible. It's true that black's knight is on pre here on e5, but so is white's bishop. Then John Nunn discovered the beautiful refutation, which actually gives white a very strong position, and that is f7 check. That's a very difficult move to see. Just have a look at that for a moment before we go on. Apparently, this little pawn move gives white a crushing advantage in all lines. For instance, if king d8 in this position, then the strongest move for white here is queen to g5 check. And when black goes bishop e7, just queen takes e5. And white will be able to keep his pawn on f7. An incredibly powerful pawn, very difficult for black to get rid of. I assess that particular position as winning for white. Black has two ways to take the pawn on f7, but both of these leave him with a miserable position. For instance, if he takes with the knight. Now both queens are on pre. Well, now I think queen e2 check is a very strong move. If black doesn't want to lose his queen, he's got to play knight e5. And now bishop takes e5. Looks like a crushing fork. Let's say black plays bishop b4 check. It's as good as anything else in this position, if black doesn't want to avoid losing lots of material. And now I think simply king d1 is a very strong move. Winning. Finally, if black takes on f7 with the king, king takes f7, then the simple move is best. Bishop takes d5 check. Black plays his king to e8. He couldn't go anywhere else. Queen takes e5 check. Queen takes e5, only move. Bishop takes e5. Again, black is reduced to playing only moves in this position. That's bishop b4 check. White plays his king to d1. Rook comes to f8, only move. You see, it's all quite deep. And now white plays a very strong move indeed, a3. And the point of this move is to drive the bishop off the diagonal e1 to a5. For instance, let's say bishop a5, b4, bishop b6. Time enough to allow white to play rook to e1. And as you can see, with a crushing developmental advantage. For the moment, the Siberian trap appears to be on ice. Carrying on now, and before we get into the specific theory of the Morra, I'd like to show you a couple of inspiring games, which I hope will encourage you to play this particular opening. And the first of these is the very recent game between Akram Mohammed and Magid, Cairo 1999. It's one of the very few Morra Gambit games which have actually appeared in Informator. Okay, white played e4, c5, d4, c takes d4, c3, d takes c3, knight takes c3. And actually in this game we're going to see black play the solid main line. It's the line that's been played most often by black, where he's supposed to get a very, very rock solid game. Okay, black played d6, bishop came out to c4, e6, white castled, black played knight f6, queen e2, bishop e7, and now rook to d1. And as we've seen already, that sets up a vicious threat of e5. This is why black normally plays e6 to e5 in this position, although that move appears like a loss of time. It's important in the sense that it holds white up. And now there are two moves here for white. The modern move, I'm not going to recommend this move on the tape, is bishop e3, hoping to dispense with the move h3. Against that, black can probably get away with bishop g4. I'm not sure I like that too much for white. White has to take quite a lot of risks in that particular variation to get a good position. Instead, on this video, I'm going to recommend the older move, the safer move, which is h3, preparing bishop e3, and that's the move that Akram Mohammed played, not allowing black his pin. Alright, black castles, we're still in the main line, and now bishop comes out to e3. Black plays a6, and white brings his rook to c1. So here we have the position of full development in the Morra Gambit. What is white going to do with this particular position? Okay, we'll see later on that black has several moves in this position. He can play h6, bishop e6 has been played very commonly. In this particular game, black plays bishop to d7. I presume the idea of that is to defer for a moment the position of the queen, the black queen, and to maybe give support to a possible advance b5 when the knight on c6 is protected. I don't know. Other than that, it looks rather an odd move to me. Now, the normal moves in this position have been the non-committal a3, but Akram comes out with a very strong novelty in this position, knight to a4. Now, at first sight, that move seems impossible because, well, black can play b5, can't he, winning a piece. But Akram shows that he's got it all worked out. Black played b5, and the answer to that was a slightly surprising bishop to d5. And that was white's idea. Well, obviously, black can take on a4 now, but I think that would lead to a pretty cheerless endgame position for him when white locks off the knight on c6. It shouldn't be too difficult for white to get the pawn back, and when he gets the pawn back, black's own pawn position will be compromised, so that would lead to difficulties for black. Thus, Magid lops the bishop off. White takes with the e-pawn. And now black played knight to d4. Well, you can see why he does that. He gives the pawn back, hoping to gain some freedom for his pieces. And you can also see why he didn't take the knight on a4, because after d takes c6, that pawn is going to be pretty difficult to remove. Blocks out the black major pieces, and also I think, well, white can maybe play queen c2 and get the pawn back on a4. And when black moves his bishop, let's say to e6 or f5, then I think white can think about playing knight takes e5, which is again a very common trick and trap in the Morra Gambit. You can see white's rooks. Those are the extra pieces he had in the game. Knight takes e5 takes full advantage of that feature of the position. So taking on a4 wouldn't be very good for black. thus knight d4. But again, once again, Akram shows he's got the tactics under control by taking on d4 with the bishop. He takes d4. And now a very strong move, giving white the advantage, knight to b6, which of course was the point of putting the knight on a4 in the first place. Again, it's very difficult for black to meet this move. If he takes the knight with his queen, then the bishop disappears on e7, and white's queen would take up a very dominating position there. On top of that, black's bishop's pretty miserable, and white is going to take on d4 with a knight. And once that knight gets to d4, let's just see this line. Queen takes b6, queen takes e7, bishop moves, let's say, to f5, knight takes d4. You can see just how powerful that knight is. It towers over the position. I assess black's position is almost lost. So that variation explains black's rather desperate looking move, d3. Now the point of this was that after rook takes d3, queen takes b6, we're actually going back into the previous line, but then black hopes to gain the tempo with bishop f5, preventing for at least a little while the white knight from coming to d4. Doesn't matter, such is the nature of white's advantage in this position, he can afford to lose that tempo and still play powerful moves. Rook e3. And as you can see, white has complete control of the position. Black tried to challenge one of the open files with rook a c8. Rook takes on c8. And now black must capture with the bishop. If he takes back with the rook on c8, then queen e8 leads to checkmate. Thus, bishop takes c8. But what we have here is a typical situation in the Morra where material equality has been re-established, but white is left with the more active pieces. And Akram's exploitation of the active pieces is a joy to watch. He kicks off with knight to g5. Now that really puts the pressure on. In actual fact, white is threatening knight takes h7 in this position. And I guess h6 would also be answered by knight h7. Not an easy move to meet. Black put his bishop on f5. White played rook f3. And black played bishop g6. But now came another very strong move, knight to e6. Highlighting the miserable nature of that rook on f8. Well, black played rook to c8 here. Rook came across to c3. Very powerful move indeed. Taking the open file. Black can't take the rook because of mate on the back rank. Queen went to b8. And now all sorts of tactical motives come into play based upon the weakness of black's back rank. Because white now played another excellent move. Queen takes d6. Well, as you can see, it's getting pretty disgusting for black. He has to play queen a8 here. Knight came to c7. Queen b7. And now queen takes a6. And this move simply leaves white with a winning endgame. The game didn't last much longer. Let's see the last few moves. Queen takes queen. Knight takes queen. Black was forced to trade pieces, which obviously he doesn't want to do. Rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, king f8, and then d6, forced resignation. White's next move will be knight c5, and the d6 pawn is unassailable. Well, from a state-of-the-art game, we move back in time now to 1962, when we see Mikhail Tal in charge of the white pieces. All I can say is, after seeing this game, you'll find it a great pity that Tal didn't play the Morra Gambit more often. His victim is a guy called Nabalt. Never heard of him before or after this game. Riga 1962. And it's quite an instructive game that it features a position where black puts his queen on c7 and white plays bishop f4 and does black over. So we should see this game. It's quite enjoyable. Well, white's about to play bishop c4 here. Very familiar situation. And we get quickly to a mainline position. Now, in the last game, black played bishop e7 and e5. Here he tries something different. He plays the a6 system, d1, and as soon as that rook hits the d file, black gets his queen out of harm's way. But is it really out of harm's way on the c file? Well, as we've seen, there are ideas when white puts his rook on c1 of knight d5, so black's not out of the woods yet. Okay, Tao played bishop f4, and as I said, that's probably an effective place to put the bishop, only when black puts his queen on c7. And black played knight to e5. I think you'll agree with me, that's quite a decent move. Bishop came back to b3, bishop e7, rook ac1. And now we see the dark side of the move queen c7, because, frankly, in view of white's threat of knight d5, that queen has to move again. And Nibor was forced to lose time here with queen to b8. Now came a very strong move, typical Tao, knight to d4. Avoiding exchanges and preparing bishop g3 and f4, exploiting the unfortunate position of the exposed black knight. After knight d4, black castled. Can't fault that, has to do something. And then the bishop came to g3, not only protecting the possible weaknesses on h2 and f2, but also preparing this move f4. And Nibor was so afraid of this move f4 that he retreated his knight from the centre, knight e to d7. And Tao played f4 anyway. Well, such was Tao's reputation as an attacking genius at that time that I think Nibor was so overwhelmed by the thought of white attacking him on the king side that he got very afraid and uptight and made a mistake in this position. It's not clear exactly what he should do in this position because black is very cramped. For instance, he'd like to move his b pawn, but that's completely out of the question in view of knight to c6. He'd like to think about playing, for instance, knight to c5 here, but then simply comes bishop c2. And the move e5 is going to be pretty overwhelming because, as you can see, that bishop has now rerouted to an incredibly strong diagonal right down to h7 there. So that doesn't seem to be much good for black either. And my general opinion of the black position is very cramped. White also has tactical possibilities of a sacrifice on e6, rather in the manner of the Sozin variation. Black is very passive here, despite the fact he's a pawn up. The pawn is worthless in this position. But the move Nibor played was almost disastrous. He played e5. Simply can't be good, because it allows, first of all, the move knight f5, which Tao must have been licking his lips over. But not only that, there's a potential disaster looming on the d5 square, and queen to c4 is also waiting in the wings. So suddenly, after e5, I think black's position is just lost. I mean, it's really bad here. Nibor played rook e8, but of course it has to be said that Nibor was very intimidated by the way Tao's played this game, just sacrificing the pawn, getting his pieces on excellent squares, and then starting the attack. I mean, it's an ideal Morra Gambit game, really. Rook e8 was played queen c4, absolutely disgusting move for black to meet. You can see f7 is under fire, after which black's position will crumble. He played the best that he could, d5. I'm afraid this move is not good enough. Knight takes d5. So now, look at white's position, it's completely overwhelming. He's not even material down. Black's position is a complete joke. Bishop c5 check. King h1. And now the most unnatural move, rook to e6. And now comes a typical Tao finish, rather beautiful. He played the lovely move here, queen takes c5. Absolute poetry. Black can't take the queen. If he plays knight takes c5, knight takes f6 check, leads to mate. Rather nice, isn't it? So after queen takes c5, black went knight takes d5, rook takes d5, e takes f4, knight e7 check, king f8, and now rook takes d7. Very nice finish this. Bishop takes d7, bishop takes e6. Black had had quite enough of this game. 1-0. And finally in this section, and which will give encouragement to all of you prospective Morra Gambiteers, I'm going to show you part of a game between Landa with white and world champion Garry Kasparov with black. And this was played in one of Kasparov's simuls in Russia during 1988. And it's unique because, well, white should really have defeated the world champion with the Morra Gambit. That doesn't happen every day. We come back to the main line position. White's just playing his move knight to f3. Kasparov played e6, bishop c4, and now a6. So a different system again by black. White should treat this with quick development, this type of thing. White castled, and now knight g to e7. There are other moves, we'll see them later. And Landa played bishop g5. This is the accepted method against knight e7 systems. h6. Perhaps now we understand the move a6 a little bit more, because we saw earlier the trap where black had played d6 instead of a6, and white would just play knight b5 in that position, winning. Well, Kasparov cut that out. That enables him to play the move h6. No matter, because after bishop h4, white still got compensation in the form of excellent development for his minor pieces. But now Kasparov sharpened the struggle. He played g5, bishop g3, knight g6. So what black is essentially trying to do in this line is to take control of the central dark squares, notably e5 and f4. And white must strive might and main to break that control. Now this is one of the rare cases in the Morra Gambit where white's queen finds better employment on a square other than e2. And in this position, white played an excellent move here, queen d2. Now the idea of this is to keep pressure on the d file. He's going to put major pieces on the d file, and he keeps the square f4 firmly under observation. Black played d6, and white played rook a to d1. So this is white's idea, to put the pressure on the d6 pawn. And in this position already, black saw no advantageous way to keep his pawn, so he was just quite happy to return it with bishop e7. White played bishop b3. Now that's an interesting one, because he could have taken his pawn back on d6. He didn't do so, I think, because he felt that black's control of e5 and f4 was just sufficient to ensure that black would have had a very comfortable ending there. So white prefers to keep the pressure on. Kasparov played knight g e5. Okay, knight takes e5. D takes e5 by Kasparov, queen to e3. And black played queen to a5. And it's here that white must act very quickly, because actually I think black is threatening to get control of this position. For instance, if he were allowed to play the simple move, say knight d4, if not sooner, then certainly later, then I think black is just blocking white's attack completely. So white must strive to avoid that possibility. And this is why Landa now played an excellent move here, knight to d5. This is very, very strong. Well, what is black to do here? If he takes a knight, and of course Kasparov didn't take that knight, it's far too dangerous to take that knight. If he takes the knight, then I think white captures with the pawn. And this is very disruptive. I don't think black can keep his extra material here, for if he moves that knight, then white will take on e5, probably with the bishop, maybe with the queen, and with d6 waiting in the wings. This is very disruptive. I would say that white is doing extremely well in that type of position. So black did well not to take that knight. Kasparov played bishop d8, and white played rook to c1. Bishop came to d7, and white played rook c5. Black played b5, and it's now that white misses his chance. In the game, white played queen f3, and okay, this is fine for white. The game was eventually drawn in 56 moves. But according to John Nunn here, white missed his chance to defeat the world champion. He should have played rook takes knight on c6. This takes away a defender of e5, so white's next would be fairly clear cut. Bishop takes e5. And now, well, what's black to play here? If he castles, for instance, Bishop c3 is the move. That's the point of white's play. It's rather difficult to see, isn't it? Black's queen is trapped. I guess that would be the answer to rook g8 or rook f8 as well. Black would have to play b4 here, and then bishop takes b4. Puts black right into trouble. Well, I think white would simply emerge from this position a clear pawn up. So we must assume that Landa could win that. I think white missed a win. Proof positive that the Morra Gambit is dangerous against even the strongest possible opposition. Well, now we come to the theoretical part of the video. What I'm essentially doing for you in this section is to pare down the best white reply against each individual black system for you, to give recommendations. What you will see is in that most of the lines white retains practical chances, but not necessarily the objective advantage. However, I don't think that should deter you from playing with white at the Morra Gambit, because black's really got to know his stuff, even to demonstrate an equal position, whereas you can quite happily play confidently with initiative, with lots of chances to win, so that shouldn't deter you at all. Now, the first line I want to examine is the so-called main line, where black just sets up a nice solid position here. Knight f6, typical Sicilian moves, queen e2, bishop e7, rook d1, e5. And this is the starting position of the so-called main line. Now, lots of authorities have claimed that this is the best way for black to treat the Morra Gambit. I don't particularly believe it. I think it's a rather passive way of going about things. Firstly, black's position is, although it's solid, is very reactive. Black is actually waiting for white to do something before he can do something himself. That's why I don't really like it. Black doesn't really have too many plans of his own. And I don't really like the fact that black has given white the d5 square there, either for knight or bishop. This commits black to more or less playing with the move bishop e6, after which white can take that bishop and hope to play against the weakened black pawns. So, in my opinion, black doesn't get an easy ride in this particular system, and I forecast that this will drop away in terms of popularity. I'm going to recommend the move h3 here. That move is directed against black's threat of bishop g4, followed by knight d4. And as we've mentioned before on this tape, the move h3 prepares the move bishop e3, and the bishop won't be molested by knight to g4. So it's a sensible move all round. Black will castle, and then bishop e3 bring to the critical position. And black has several moves here. Now, we saw an example of the move a6 in the very recent game between Akram Mohammed and Majid. But there, after rook ac1, black played the slightly odd move bishop d7, which is not necessarily his best. However, I believe that black has a slightly awkward problem to solve in this position, in that bishop e6, which looks like a natural move, seems to give white the advantage after bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and now knight to a4. This move is rather awkward for black to meet. According to LevonFisch, black is supposed to play knight d7 here, but then queen c4 is a good move, putting the pressure on the weakened e6 pawn. The point of this move is that after rook f6, defending the pawn, then white can go bishop to g5. Very awkward. And after rook g6, he can play the very interesting move rook takes d6. This is all Flesch's analysis. Bishop takes g5, rook c d1. Well, it's very difficult for black this position. If he plays knight d4, at the very least, white can take on e5, leaving lots of black's pieces attacked. If he plays knight c b8, which is a terribly disgusting move, but it's the only move Flesch could see by which black survives, then rook takes e6 is strong. King h8, rook takes g6, we're still following analysis by Flesch. H takes g6, knight takes g5, queen takes g5, And now the finishing touch is supplied with queen to c8 check, king h7, queen takes b7, highlighting black's complete lack of coordination throughout the preceding 10 or so moves. Black is lost here. Returning to the position after white has just played bishop e3, I don't think the move a6 is all that great for black. And so let's concentrate now on bishop e6, which is supposedly the main line move. Solid option. If white takes on e6, black is taken back with the pawn and he gains some chances along the f-file, or so the story goes. Just to show you it's not all roses for black, I'm going to have a look at the game Neil Carr, FIDE master from England, against Grandmaster Plaskett from the British Chess Federation Championship, Brighton 1984, where white played rook ac1, rook c8. Note, if black took on c4, that would cede white complete control of d5. And now Carr simply took on e6, bishop takes e6, f takes e6. And now if white didn't have a good move in this position, you begin to think that black was getting over the worst. Fortunately, white does have a good move, and that move is b4. And that's a move that crops up quite a lot in the main line. Now the idea of this is that if black takes that pawn with knight takes b4, white could consider knight takes e5. That is possible and in the position. But a stronger move, I believe, is queen to b5. And then Carr gives the following analysis. He gives d5 as the best move for black. We quickly see that black's pawns are very exposed here, and knight takes e5 is the one that white captures first, the central pawn. Carr gives a6, hoping to drag the white queen into a whirlpool of complications. And after bishop d6, f4. We go on with Carr's analysis, rook b8, queen a7, queen a5. So the whole point of black's play is to try and expose white's queen down there on a7. It seems as though white escapes unscathed after 20 knight c4. This is an excellent move. And after d takes c4, rook takes d6, knight d3, rook takes a6, still analysis by Carr, queen b4, rook c2, knight takes e4, hoping for knight takes e4, queen b1 check, picking up the white rook, and now rook a4 is an excellent move, which I think wins. Return therefore to the position after b4. You can see why Plaskett found it unattractive to take on b4 with his knight, and he played a6, whereupon white played b5. Well, this is a very good move. If a takes b5, queen takes b5. And I think this gives white slightly the better of the game in view of black's exposed pawns. A move like knight a4 is very much on the cards, for instance after queen d7, and then knight b6. That gives white slightly the better of the game, I would have thought. So Plaskett played knight b8, which is a pretty miserable move because it allows white to effect his secondary threat, knight takes e5, queen a5, and then there are two good moves here. In the game, Carr played knight f3 and went on to win nicely in 41 moves. I think the best move, however, for white here is knight c4, which Carr initially thought was good for black after queen b4. But then John Nunn, who apparently looked at this game very closely, saw that rook d4 was actually a very strong move. Queen c5 appears forced, and then white should play queen d1 here, with a strong attack against black's exposed pawns. For instance, if e5, then knight d5 is a very good move. Not an easy move to see. threatening the bishop on e7. And if knight takes d5, rook takes d5, queen b4, bishop d2. Seems that the black queen is getting into trouble in this line, and thus it can't be recommended to black. Back now to the position after white's 11th move, bishop e3, and another move for black is h6. In fact, another move which can't be recommended. Now, the motivation for this move is that black is preparing to play the move bishop e6, and he doesn't want white's knight coming to g5 thereafter to attack his weakened pawn on e6. He also stops bishop g5 at any stage and gives his king a flight square. But I don't believe h6 is a good move. Let me show you why. Here's the game Len White, International Master, versus Drinovich, the Veldon Open 1993. White played rook ac1, all as per the programme. Bishop e6, we've seen this before. Bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and now the key move in this whole system, b4. We've seen already that after knight takes b4, white plays not knight takes e5. Well, he could play knight takes e5 in this particular position because black's weakened the g6 square, but usually he would play queen b5. Let's just see that. So this move is possible, with possible entry point there, although black should play queen e8. But maybe stronger is this move, highlighting the weakness of the black pawns. In my opinion, white gets a strong initiative in this line if black takes on b4. So back at Len White Drinovich, a6 was the reply. And now an interesting move by white, a4. The idea being that if black plays knight takes b4, white plays knight takes e5 with good compensation in view of the g6 square and the threat of knight c4 tying up the black squares on the queen side. Drinovich didn't take that pawn. Instead he played queen e8. White ploughed on with b5. Knight d8. And white's bishop went to b6. So I would say this is a typical position in the main line. Black's quite solid. He's got no real prospects of active play. He's just got to sit it out. And there aren't many players who have really got the temperament to do this. Drinovich tried queen f7. White played knight d2. Knight d7 by black, hoping to get rid of the bishop. But knight c4 was the reply. So a nice manoeuvre by white there. A takes b5 was played. A takes b5. And black played d5, hoping to liberate his pieces. In fact, if he didn't play d5, it's difficult to see an active plan for black. White's just threatening to take on d8 and then take on d6. So black just couldn't sit idly by and do nothing. But after d5, he takes d5. He takes d5, knight takes d5. White has actually successfully capitalised on his leading development afforded him by the early sacrifice of the Morra Gambit pawn, and went on to win nicely. Let's see how. Black played bishop g5, attacking the white rook on c1. Rook played to c2, and black played rook a4. Black's major problem in this position is if you look at white's game, it's together. White's very well coordinated. His pieces seem to be working as a unit. Black's position's a bit splayed out. It's not clear to me that the rook on a4 is cooperating very well with the rest of black's pieces. White played knight takes e5. Knight takes e5, queen takes e5. And knight e6 was the reply. g3 by white. A good move, taking away the f4 square from black's pieces. Rook e8. And now queen to d6. So plenty of coordination here for white. He probably wants to transfer his rooks to the e-file, creating a very unpleasant pin. Black couldn't find a good way to break white's coordination. He tried queen h5. That's a double attack. But after rook e1, queen takes h3, rook c e2, black is actually in desperate straits. He has no decent move. He tried rook d8, but after bishop takes d8, knight d4, rook e8 check, king h7, queen f8, the curtains are drawn. White wins. Summarising, I believe if black plays this way against the Morra Gambit, you should be happy. You're going to get all the chances and natural squares for your pieces. Remember the initial setup with h3 and then bishop e3. You follow up with rook ac1 and then b4 is the move to put black under pressure, targeting his weak central pawns. Maybe black can last out the pressure, but it's going to be difficult and not many of your opponents will be up to the task. The next system I'd like to examine is the one recommended by Joe Gallagher in his book Beating the Anti-Sicilians. Now normally Joe is a very diligent author, excellent author in my opinion, but here I like to take issue with one of the lines that he recommends. We see before us a quite normal position where white's about to play knight f3, d6, bishop c4, and now Gallagher recommends the move a6. Now we can see this, I think, not as an attempt to prepare b5, but more a high-class waiting move. Black is waiting for white to commit himself, then he responds with knight f6. For instance, white should castle in this position, and now knight f6 is the move. We saw in the introduction that if black had played that move immediately, he gets blasted away with e5. Now that move's not applicable, as black has taken away the b5 square from one of white's knights. So, white has to adjust his plans in this position. Black is actually threatening bishop g4 in this position, followed by, let's say, knight e5. This would be very awkward for white to meet. And I'm going to recommend the move h3 to you, just taking that move away from black. After h3, play would normally proceed e6, queen e2, bishop e7, rook d1. When I suppose black could transpose to the main line with e5, we've already seen what happens if he does. But if he wants to strike out on an independent course, Joe Gallagher reckons that bishop d7 is the best way to do it. The point being that queen c7 would probably be met by bishop f4, followed by maybe rook ac1 with knight d5 threats, or even rook d2 and rook a d1. That deployment is not out of the question. So bishop d7 is probably the most accurate move for black there. And now Gallagher gives bishop f4, which I still think to be the best move. And then comes b5, bishop b3, queen b8. He reckons that this is the best way for black against white's setup. Well, now I think black is threatening knight e5, which would block white. Accordingly, e5 is the move I'm going to recommend to you. Still following Gallagher's recommendation, he reckons this is perfectly okay for black. I'm not so sure. D takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, and now Gallagher says that the point of b5 was to be able to play queen b7 in this position, with a comfortable game for black. We'll carry on a little bit further with his analysis. He gives bishop takes f6. Well, if black captured with the g pawn in this position, I think it's difficult to see where his king's going to go. So bishop takes f6. Now knight e4 is a good move. Bishop e7. And now in the game Montavon-Gallagher, Neuchâtel, 1994, white played the excellent move bishop d5 in this position. Now we can see immediately if black takes that bishop with the pawn, knight d6 check is a killer. So Black's reply is forced after that, and that's bishop c6. White should take this, queen takes c6, and then rook ac1, with what I consider to be very good Morra Gambit compensation. Now, according to Gallagher, after queen b6, queen f3, white only has drawing chances in this position. According to my analysis, I believe white can work up good chances here. For instance, if black castles in this position, then what could be more natural than the move rook to d7? Now this poses black an awkward problem. If he moves his bishop, well, there's no decent square. If he defends his bishop, then rook a e8 is rather inelegant. For instance, if white just doubles on the 7th rank, you can see that white has serious pressure. The best way to defend the black bishop must be rook a7. But now I think white can play a very strong move here. Possibly Joe missed this move, and that is rook to c6, which sets up serious positional pressure on black. Obviously, black can't take either rook. If he takes on d7, white takes the queen. If he takes on c6, knight f6 check wins his queen. Thus, the only move for black after rook c6 is queen b8. And now, at the very least, I believe white can play rook takes a7, queen takes a7, queen to c3, with the threat of rook to c7, when I believe white is in charge of this position. For instance, if black defends himself with bishop d8, that leaves his rook f8 passive, and we can play knight d6, increasing our control. So I believe this line to be good for white. The second line, rook d8, sees black trying to challenge white's supremacy in the centre. But now I believe white's best plan is rook takes d8 check, again essentially forcing black's reply. If black takes with the king in this position, that would be a terrible mistake, because then f7 would hang. If he takes with the bishop in this position, well, now there's a very strong move, rook c6, forcing the pace. The next move is knight d6 check, and black can't take on c6 with the queen because of knight f6 check. So I believe this variation is also good for white. Must be. Thus, after rook takes d8 check, the only move is queen takes d8. And now, once again, the move Gallagher underestimated in this variation, rook to c6, puts black under a lot of pressure. At the moment, the a6 pawn is on pre. And if black defends his pawn, well, with a5 for instance, then I think queen h5 is a good move. A double hit, threatening queen takes b5, which if allowed to take would give white a 2-1 majority on the queen side and more actively placed pieces. And white also threatens rook takes c6, which is a nice move. So that double hit essentially gives white much the better of the game. A second line after rook c6 sees black giving back the a6 pawn in order to get developed. For instance, he can castle in this position. But I don't believe that leads to a very good game for him. For instance, if white plays rook takes a6 straight away, he's already threatening the pawn on b5. And let's say black plays a move like queen d5 in this position, trying to centralise his pieces. Well then, knight c3 is a good move, forcing queen c4, queen takes c4, b takes c4, and then white can choose between rook a7 or rook c6, in both cases with vastly the superior endgame. The next section I want to consider in this video is the fianchetto defence. That occurs after white plays knight f3, and now black plays the very logical looking move g6, hoping to obtain a position reminiscent of the dragon. And now the normal move for white is bishop c4, but I'm going to recommend that white departs from the norm against this fianchetto variation and really goes for the throat. I'm going to recommend a very little known move in this position, which I think is actually good for white, and that is 6h4. Now, there isn't much evidence on this line either way. Let me just show you some of the lines which I believe to be good for white. For instance, in the game Leonidov, Ignatieff, USSR 1962, black played bishop g7. I think you'll agree that's the most consistent move. But white retained tremendous attacking chances after h5, d6, bishop c4, bishop e6, knight d5, g takes h5, knight g5. In this position, white has a tremendous attack. Obviously, some of those moves looks a bit dodgy from black's point of view. But the problem was, if he played knight f6 instead of g takes h5, then I think h6 is a good move. And this completely disrupts the flow of black's development. For if bishop f8, white can choose between knight takes f6 check, laming black's pawn structure, or the more direct knight g5. In both cases, with excellent chances. Going back to the position after 6h4, I imagine a lot of your opponents will become very scared and might play 6h5. In this case, I believe white obtains improved chances to the normal Morra Gambit with a simple move bishop c4. And if bishop g7, then queen b3 is an excellent move, pointing up the weaknesses in black's position. For instance, black would not really want to play the move e6 here. Now white has several good moves in this position. Knight b5 will be one of those moves. Bishop g5 must be another dangerous move. And bishop f4 must be a third move. Of the three, I probably prefer knight b5, but it's pretty clear that e6 is a horrible move to have to make and doesn't blend in with g6 at all. Accordingly, Burgess gives the move knight a5 in this position, which looks incredibly risky. White plays bishop takes f7 check, and after king f8 goes queen d5. And then I presume black reveals his point by playing knight f6 in this position, when it seems as though the white queen has to retreat, and then black will take on f7. Nevertheless, queen d3 is an excellent move now, aiming at the weakened g6 square. And we'll follow some analysis by Fisch. King takes f7, knight g5 check, king g8, e5, knight h7, and now queen to d5 check is a killer blow. For if e6, which is the only move not to allow mate in one, then knight takes e6, and black's position is wrecked. We'll carry on with some more of this entertaining Fisch analysis, and imagine that black plays knight f6 in response to h4. Well, e5 looks like an interesting move for white, but I reckon the best move here is h5, just getting on with it. The point of this move is that if black takes on h5 with the knight, then we're going to go all in with rook takes h5. G takes h5, knight g5. And this attack is incredibly difficult to meet. Totally direct, with threatening queen takes h5 and then checkmate on f7. Fisch gives the following line. Pawn to e6, enabling black to defend with his queen. Queen takes h5, queen e7, and now the not so surprising move, knight b5. So it's very crude play by white, but incredibly difficult to meet. The threat, of course, is knight c7. Thus, d6, bishop f4, e5, and now knight takes f7, an incredible move. Queen takes f7, knight c7 check. Well, black's a bit limited. He's got to play king e7, otherwise he loses his queen. But then bishop g5, Nabs the black queen. White wins. It's pretty clear that much remains to be explored about the move 6h4. Why don't you give your opponents a shock and try this move out? The next system I'd like to examine was recommended by I.M. Jeremy Silman in his excellent work Winning with the Sicilian Defence. You'll recall we reach our normal position after bishop c4, e6, castles, and now instead of developing the knight to f6, Silman recommends bishop e7, queen e2, a6, rook d1, bishop d7, and he says this is a very tough nut to crack. Now the way black has played it, he's taken away all possibilities of white playing e5. That's the first point. So white's got to struggle to find, firstly, a good square for this bishop. As you can see, black hasn't committed his queen yet to c7, and black is probably going to play queen b8 in one go. So all in all, it's a high-class waiting system for black. Well, in my opinion, white should play bishop f4 here. Now, if black plays queen b8 in this position, then I think white should play e5, take the opportunity to play this very aggressive move. The normal move for black after bishop f4 is e5. And black is hoping to get an improved version of the main line by setting up this position. Then comes bishop e3, knight f6 by black, and white should play rook ac1 in this position. Now, if black plays knight g4 here, which looks good, Burgess gives bishop d2 as best. The idea being that, okay, white's lost a bit of time with his bishop, but he's going to regain the tempo he lost with h3. So that shouldn't worry white too much. Accordingly, the normal move is castles in this position for black. And now we're going to follow the game Moore versus Yertenis NATO Team Championships 1990, where white obtained a firm grip on the position. He played a3, and black played h6. Now, just taking that move h6 back, I don't think that's best. I believe that rook c8, which is a more useful move all round, should be preferred. The point is that after b4, b5, bishop d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, a rather balanced game has resulted. I assess this position as equal because white can follow up with a move like rook c2 and then rook d2, and he'll probably get his pawn back on d6 with an equal position. I think this is black's best way to play the variation. But there are plenty of chances to go wrong, as can be seen from the natural move b5, played in the game Moore versus George, Washington 1989. In that game, white played bishop to d5, black went queen e8, white played h3, rook c8 was played, and white played b4. Now the move b4 might appear weird, but it does cut down on black's chances of counterplay. Knight takes d5 was played, knight takes d5, and black played bishop e6, so it is similar to the line we were looking at earlier. In this position, white plays knight b6, a slightly tricky move to meet. The idea is that after rook c7, white plays rook c3, with good chances to either double rooks in the c or d files, pressurising the black position. Back to more Yertenis now, and black played the move h6, white played the familiar move b4, and after b5, the bishop came to d5. Then came rook c8. And here we see Moore adopting a familiar plan with rook to c2. It's very logical for white to double rooks on the c file in this way. Black played queen e8, rook d to c1, king h7. Black doesn't seem to be able to think of anything constructive to do. White went queen d3. Black played g6, white h3, and black played knight h5. and white continued his constriction policy with the sharp move g4. The idea of this was that after knight f4, white takes the knight, bishop takes f4, e takes f4, and now key move, taking on c6 with the bishop. Black took back with the rook, and then white played knight d4, producing a position which is excellent for white. White has a firm grip on the key d5 square and will control the all-important c-file. The rest of the game was distinctly unpleasant for black. Giertnes tried rook c4, and of course, Moore played knight d5. That is clearly the best move here. Now the two knights tower over the black bishops in this position, despite the fact that black is still a pawn up. Rook takes c2 happened, rook takes c2, and black played bishop e6. And white saw a favourable way to get his pawn back, retaining an active game. He played knight c7. That forces black's hand, queen d7 only move, and now knight d takes e6. F takes e6, knight takes a6. Now white has won back his pawn. The black pawn structure still looks rather shaky, and there's an immediate threat of rook to c7. And that's why black chose bishop d8 here. But then came knight b8, queen g7, and now queen takes d6. White went on to win this very favourable position in short order. A similar system for black, which might be tried by your opponents, involves the same sort of hedgehog 3-row type setup. Knight f3 d6, bishop c4 e6, castles a6, queen e2, should be getting used to this setup by now, knight f6, rook d1, and now black plays queen to c7. Personally, I don't rate this setup for black. This early development of the queen seems a bit too provocative to me. And the best move is bishop f4, after which we're going to follow the interesting game Matulovic versus Segi, Yugoslavia 1953. Now in that game, black played a very plausible move here, knight e5. It looks good, but in fact it's very bad. Before I show you why, we should look at the move e5, which frankly I could see my opponents playing straight away after bishop f4. Seems natural to gain a tempo. White's best move in this position is knight d5. Very forceful and does black over as far as I can see. For instance, if black plays knight takes d5, we take back with a pawn, and now black has to move his knight. If he plays knight e7, the move knight takes e5 is extremely strong. In fact, that blows black away more or less straight away. So black shouldn't do that. If he plays knight a5, then rook ac1 is very strong. For instance, if knight takes c4, rook takes c4, queen e7. The simplest way to refute this stuff is bishop takes e5. And this is a devastating move. For if pawn takes bishop, d6, queen e6, rook takes c8 check, an absolute bone-crushing move, rook takes c8, d7, and black is getting wasted. Back to the game Matulovic versus Segi now. And Matulovic kicked off with a very powerful move here, bishop takes e5. The point being, of course, that after d takes e5, white wants to play rook ac1. This position is almost winning for white. For instance, if black were to play queen b8 here, then I think bishop b5 check is an incredibly strong move. For instance, if black takes this bishop with a takes b5, then knight takes b5 is immediately incredibly strong. That would lead to a winning attack in view of the threat of knight c7 check. The best way was shown by Janos Flesch in a simultaneous display of his 1960. He played bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, and now knight to g5. The idea of this is to position the queen as actively as possible, possibly on h5, maybe on c4, maybe on f3. It depends what black does. His opponent, Bodnar, tried knight f6, but then came the move queen c4, threatening sacrifices on e6. Black played bishop e7, and after that knight a4 was a strange but very strong move, tying black up completely. Black castled, and white went knight b6. Rook a7 was the move, and knight takes e6 completed the hatchet job on black's position. The finish was rook e8, knight c7, rook d8, rook takes d8 check, bishop takes d8, and now stop the tape and see if you can see white's next brilliant move. I bet you didn't see knight c8, which is the move that Fisch played. A quite amazing move, which completely ties black up. The game finished rook takes a8, knight takes a8, queen takes a8, and then queen c8, to which black has no answer. It's a very, very nice finish. Well, you might think that was bad, but what actually happened to Segi in this game was even worse, because instead of queen b8, he went bishop d7. Now came a crushing denouement. Bishop takes e6. We saw something like this before earlier in the video in an analogous position. Here it's just as crushing. The idea is to expose the position of the black queen on the c-file with knight d5. This is an absolutely devastating move. Segi tried queen b8. I suppose he could have tried knight takes d5 in this position, when white does best just to take back on d5 with the pawn. Why take the queen and create complications? Here he retains his attack, he's going to get his piece back, black's king is stuck in the centre. This must lead to a winning position for white. This is the best way. So black played the utterly awful queen b8, and Matulovic crunched home. He played knight c7 check, king e7, queen d2. A devastating move, threatening nasty checks on d6 and b4. Knight e8 was the only move. Knight takes e6, f takes e6, and it's time for the black king to go for walkies. Queen d7 check was the move. King f6. And now another very strong move, knight g5. Easy to do, of course, with all black's pieces on the back rank. Well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Black took this knight with the king, and queen takes e6 prevented the black king from coming back. Black went knight f6, queen f5 check, king h6, and now rook c3. It was absolutely devastating. Queen e8 was the only move to prevent black from getting mated, but the game concluded rook h3 check, queen h5, pawn to g4. That's a beautiful move, isn't it? Queen takes h3, g5 check, king h5, queen takes h3 check, king takes g5, and now an echo of the earlier theme with queen f5 check, king h6, rook d3. Black struggled on for a little while with knight h5, rook h3, g6, but after rook takes h5 check, he should really have resigned, because if g takes h5, queen f6 mate. White won in a couple more trivial moves. My impression of the black system with queen c7, very early queen c7, is none too favourable. I think white should respond with bishop f4 and follow up quickly with rook ac1. He's got the usual tricks to look forward to. Knight d5, possibly e5, and by these means I think he can hope to quickly blow black out of the water. We now move on to an important area of the Morra Gambit, lines in which black plays an early knight ge7. And in the first of these lines, I'm going to take you through the game Michael Adams versus William Watson, two grandmasters, quite a rare occurrence for the Morra Gambit. And this game was played in the British Championship Eastbourne 1990. Watson tried a slightly unusual system in that when white brought his bishop out to c4, he played knight e7 straight away. Now I'm going to recommend that against all these knight e7 systems, it's probably best for white to flick in the move bishop g5. And that's exactly what Adams played here. Watson responded f6. Now if we just retract that move and give him the plausible move h6, we see that knight b5 is very strong. A similar trap was considered earlier on this video. It's no less crushing here. This is why Watson played f6, and white dropped his bishop back to e3, and black went knight g6. So Watson's trying to save a little bit of time here. He hasn't played the move d6. He might go d5 in one go somewhere. And the theme is the same. Black is trying to control the dark squares in the centre, the f4 and e5 squares. Adams continued with quick development. Castles, bishop e7, and white played queen e2. So white is setting up his pieces in the normal fashion. Now black played a6. Now this was an unfortunate move because it allowed white to play a very strong idea. What black should have done instead of a6 is to castle. Well, I'm going to recommend the move rook a d1 in this position. White's plan after rook a d1 is to go knight d4 and then f4, f5. I think this will give white good attacking chances if black had castled. Dropping back to a6, Adams found a very strong move. He played knight a4. And this is a bit of a passion killer because, well, black would like to play b5, but that is refuted completely by bishop b6. So with that threat in mind, black played queen c7, but of course that allows white to plonk his knight in on b6, and that's a tremendous outpost for the white knight. Black played rook b8, and now white gets the chance to develop his rooks in easy fashion. Rook ac1, castles, rook f d1. So this is a kind of dream position for white to get. He's got a perfect Morra position. Good development, black is cramped. White has all the chances. It's not surprising that Watson went down very quickly. What he should play in this position is king h8. Instead, he lashed out with f5 and was quickly punished. E takes f5, forced rook takes f5, and now an extremely strong move again from Adams, queen to d3. Threatening queen takes f5. Well, very difficult for black now. Not only does white threaten queen takes f5, he's threatening knight takes d7 as well, which completely dissolves black's pawn structure. Probably the best move for black here is rook takes f3, although I don't hold out much hope for black against a technician of Adams's calibre after that move. That's probably the best shot. But I think Watson was so shocked by a turn of events. I mean, it's quite unusual for a player of Adams's calibre to play the Morra Gambit. He must have been shocked by that. And then to come up with this horrible move f5, he's not in any psychological state to play good moves. He tried king h8, but after knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, queen takes d7, rook takes d7, it was clear that all the white pieces were in dominating positions, and white went on to win in 32 moves, easily. Going back, The traditional recipe for black in this position, if he wants to play knight e7, is to play it after white castles. Here white plays bishop g5 again, threatening knight to b5, queen d7. Looks slightly unnatural, but at least it steps out of the pin. However, I believe white gets good chances against this with very natural moves: queen e2, knight g6, and then rook a d1. This is a key development for the queen's rook against this black system. Put bluntly, white's idea is to play knight d4 and then f4, f5. This way he gives a very powerful white attack. And if black pushes the white bishop back with h6, so much the better. The bishop on e3 lends support to knight d4, and as mentioned, white will plough through with f4, f5, with a powerful attack. Let's now go on to examine a system which is actually given as good for black in Nunn's chess openings. Here black adopts a very funny move order by not playing knight c6 early, by going a6 on move 4. It's a very strange move. But the idea is that after knight f3, e6, bishop c4, black actually wants to develop his knight to d7. And he goes b5 first of all, driving white's bishop back, and then bishop b7. Now the first thing that white must note in this position is that black is actually threatening to go b4, so white's got to be on the ball to stop this threat. However, I can't really agree with Graham Burgess, who writes a section in Nunn's chess openings, when he gives a3 as the best move. If white has to play a3 in this type of position after sacrificing a pawn, I begin not to believe it. So let's play a more Morra Gambit-like move, queen e2 here, as was played in the game Lenoir versus Costa, Gelsenkirchen, 1991. And then according to Burgess, black's best is d6, castles by white, knight d7. Now yet another cunning move order by black is delaying the development of his kingside pieces, and again he's challenging white to find the best square for this bishop on c1, and also the rooks, by the way. Now let me show you the line that Burgess gives, which is supposed to lead to an advantage for black. He gives rook d1 as one of the main lines, and then says that black should play b4. Now I presume the idea of this is that the sacrifice knight d5 doesn't work. Black takes on d5, he takes d5 check, and now Nunn's chess openings give bishop e7, clear advantage to black. Well, as they checked everything on these incredibly powerful search engines like Fritz, well, we can probably take it that this sacrifice doesn't work. But to my eye, it seems that white is getting some compensation after, let's say, a move like knight d4. I mean, black surely must come under some sort of an attack here. It's not sufficient to just say winning for black or clear advantage to black. But anyway, that's another matter. That's something to be played and examined and tried out. Going back, and in his earlier book on the Smith-Morra, Burgess gave knight d4 and accredited this move to a guy called Shipman, a guy from the States. He updates this in Nunn's chess openings by giving b4. Again, the critical move as excellent for black. And knight d5, pawn takes knight, e takes d5 check, bishop e7. Again, clear advantage to black. Well, I'm not so sure. Once again, can't white drive an attack here with, for instance, a move like knight f5? Won't this be dangerous for black to meet? Certainly looks dangerous to me. But anyway, that's another line which seems to lead to a disadvantage for white. Although attacking players would have a lot of fun here with white, I'm pretty sure of that. Well, even from those two examples, you can see that it's pretty clear there's a lot of ground to be explored here. So I'd like to add my own tuppeny worth here by suggesting two improvements which I feel white could look at. The first of these is a very natural move, bishop f4, not mentioned anywhere. This seems to me to be perfectly logical. Puts the pressure on d6 and simply threatens the development of the rooks, either with rook d1 and rook c1, or maybe rook d1 to d2 and then double up. If black plows on with b4, as recommended, then white doesn't have to sacrifice a piece in this position. He can go knight a4. But once again, he may think about going knight d5. E takes d5, e takes d5 check, bishop e7, and this time we've got bishop takes d6. Surely white must be able to work up something here. Although, as I said, if you don't want to do this, you can play knight a4. Another interesting move for white in this position must be bishop g5, with typical Morra development. Now white will simply develop his rooks to the c and d files, or maybe double on the d file, again with compensation. He can think about following up with plans like knight d4, maybe rook d1, and then f4, f5. I think it's far too early to make any categorical judgment about this type of position. With bishop f4 and bishop g5, it should be possible for white to work up typical Morra Gambit chances. Another of those strange move order systems which black adopts to try and confuse the issue was seen in the game Chandler vs Timon, Vikings A 1982, where in this position black played the move e6, and his idea was that after knight f3 he wanted to play bishop c5. Chandler played bishop c4 and black played knight e7. So this time black is developing his kingside pieces as quickly as possible, and he'll try and work up some chances by playing castles and then either d5 or maybe even the move f5. I believe that white has to be right on the ball against this system if he wants to keep any chance of advantage. Accordingly, I'm going to recommend a move which was analysed by Shipman, and that is e5, immediately putting the grip on black's position and threatening maybe knight to e4. There are several lines now. In the first line, black castles. That's the logical move and consistent. And against that, I believe white can play either bishop g5, pinning the knight, or knight to e4. In both cases with good chances. For instance, if bishop b4 check, Shipman gives king f1, which is quite a strange move, and he believes white is getting an attack here in view of the threat of a3. It's also possible, as far as I can see, after check, just to go bishop d2, arguing that if the black square bishops are exchanged, white has a strong grip on the central dark squares. Shipman further analysed the move d5, which looks pretty logical when you see it at first. It leads to simplification, but it seems to me that white can preserve his initiative. Let me show you how. White must certainly take this pawn. Now black has two choices. The first choice must be queen takes d6, not wasting any time. White should respond, queen takes queen, bishop takes d6, and now our old friend knight b5. A tricky move to meet this, and I don't believe for an instant the move Shipman gives here, which is king d7. Of course white will get the attack. The simplest way against that is knight takes d6, king takes d6, bishop f4 check. That's a very simple way to get an excellent position. But I think after knight b5, black should play bishop b4 check. On the other hand, white has two appetising choices. The first of these is simply bishop d2. Once you take away black's dark square bishop in this line, white will get some certain chances. And the other move, of course, instead of bishop d2, you might like to play king e2 in this position, which leaves black facing threats on d6 and c7. Back to the position after e takes d6. Last time black took with the queen, this time he takes with the bishop. It's the usual move, knight to b5, putting the pressure on. Alright, black plays bishop b4 check, and now bishop d2 is certainly correct. The idea is that after bishop takes d2 check, white will take with the queen, And then as far as I can see, he's going to go back into the other line, this time with even an extra tempo at his disposal. For instance, queen takes queen check. King takes queen. Knight a6 only move. My only decent move. Knight d6 check. King f8. And now knight to g5. And black is under serious pressure. The final move for black worth considering after e5 is knight to g6. When Shipman gives knight e4, the must-play move. Now there are two moves for black here. The first line gives white obvious compensation. Black goes bishop e7 and then white just plonks his knight in on d6. This is obviously awkward for black to meet and must give white good play on the dark squares. In the second line, black goes bishop b4 check, which buys a little bit of time. And now, however much Shipman tries to convince you that king f1 is the right move, I'm sure that bishop d2 is correct. After all, black's king's bishop has moved twice. To exchange itself off, it must move a third time. White takes back with the queen, and then he's got knight d6 check to look forward to, or at least a grip on the dark squares. With h4, h5 always in the offing, I believe this is the way for white to play this variation. Accepting the Morra Gambit is a very dangerous game to play.